What is up, guys? This is Luke Hill for Kit Guru, and this is the ASUS ROG Zenith 2 Extreme Alpha. So this is the new ASUS flagship for TRX 40, and this beast comes with 16 90 amp power stages, 5 M.2 connectors, and a 1.77 inch OLED display. So for the wallet crunching price of £900, let's see what else this has to offer. If we first look at the accessory bundle, and I've got it all out on the table in front of me, we get a bunch of cables. So you've got your general affair of SATA cables. You actually get a couple of braided SATA cables, which is pretty cool to see. It helps, your system look pretty cool. You get some thermal sensor cables, you get RGB extension cables, you got your Wi-Fi adapter, because this has Wi-Fi 6, you got your typical screws and mounting hardware, your Q connector. You've got a USB drive rather than a CD for drivers. I like to see this, it's quite useful actually. Power adapter for the fan extension card, and your DIMM.2 connector. So a really healthy bundle, and of course you've got some stickers in the instruction manual. Fundamentally, when it comes to the motherboard, this is actually not really too dissimilar to the ROG Zenith 2 Extreme Non-Alpha, so the previous flagship for ASUS. The big difference here is that the power solution has been upgraded to 90 amp power stages. So I'm going to lift this up and let's have a closer look. And when I say lift this up, this is a heavy motherboard. It comes in at well over 2 kilograms, and that's basically because it's got so much aluminium and steel for the heat sinks. So steel for the backplate, aluminium for the heat sinks. This genuinely is really heavy. First thing you can note is this the general ROG styling for these days. So you get primarily black and dark greys, which I personally am quite fond of. You get RGB on board, which allows you to add some flair via colors to your preference. And the RGB lighting on board is actually pretty good. You get specific zones, so the chipset, you get the zone up here for the kind of infinity type display, and then you get an edge zone, which I like to see personally. It looks pretty cool with the RGB lighting. Obviously, what you can see size-wise is this is a very large motherboard, so it's eATX or extended ATX in form factor, and that's going to cause quite a challenge for a lot of general cases, mid-tower cases, because it's very, very wide. In my opinion, this is a bit of a challenge, but if you're buying a motherboard of this caliber, then you should have a case that can take it. And I still prefer extended ATX, which is increased width, compared to XL ATX, which is increased height, because XL is really challenging from a case perspective. Obviously at the bottom you can see we've got a shroud that covers the 2 M.2 connectors and most of the bottom half of the motherboard, quite frankly. Another notable feature I'm going to point out here early on, just to get it said, is that you get dual BIOS chips, and I quite like that because you get some redundancy, some resiliency. This is not particularly a common feature for ASUS because they have the kind of crash-free BIOS, as they would call it, but dual BIOS is very, very good for an enthusiast product like this where you might be tinkering hard, you might be overclocking. Good to see. And if I flip around to the back side and hope that the camera focuses properly, what you can see is you've got not a full cover, but a largely coverall steel backplate. Now this is cold rolled steel according to ASUS, but it's just basic steel, quite frankly. And this does make contact with specific areas of the PCB via thermal pad, so it will pull some of the heat away from the MOSFET components, or the heat that's sapping through from the MOSFET down to the PCB. That's a good thing. It's steel, so it's not going to have great conductivity, but it does add a lot of stiffness and a lot of strength. And this is a good thing, because if I try and twist this motherboard, no, it's not going to. So you're adding a lot of stiffness there, and that's important because you've got so much weight on the front end, adding stiffness on the back end, especially if you've got a heavy air cooler hanging off the socket. It's pretty important. The Live Dash OLED display is a pretty cool feature, and I quite like it here actually. So it's 1.77 inches diagonally, and it displays system information such as your CPU temperature, clock speed. It can display information when you're in the BIOS. It can say that you're updating the BIOS. So you can put general information on there, and you can have a degree of control over what is shown on there. And I like that. The 2-digit debug LED has been a user's favorite for a long, long time. I personally love it for troubleshooting. This takes it one step further, and it's a better solution, and it's pretty cool and pretty useful when you're actually using the system, not just debugging. Smart move, ASUS. I like that. The sTRX 4 CPU socket sits between a bank of 4 DIMM slots either side of it. So of course you've got your 8 total DIMM slots, and you can put it up to 256 gigabytes of standard non-ECC memory using currently available 32 gig DIMMs. ASUS does quote support for 4600 megahertz DIMMs from Corsair and G-Skill, at the high end of its memory QVL, which is pretty lofty, and you're going to have to do a fair bit of work to get that to run. But also there's support quoted in the QVL for ECC memory, if that takes your fancy, so that's good to see. But I would certainly read more on the compatibility with regards to that. The DIMM slots are the typical single latch connectors that we see from premium motherboards these days. But as you'll notice, the top latches, they're really difficult to access, so I can't actually get my thumb in there and close that right now. They are pretty difficult to deal with. ASUS does outline in the bundle that a screwdriver type tool that doubles up and closes the latches for you is provided, but that wasn't in my bundle specifically, so I can't really comment on that. It's just something to be aware of, especially if you've got large fingers like me. And then the other clear point to be aware of is that the vertical positioning of the CPU socket and the DIMM slots means that you're infringing on the top expansion slot area and even the secondary expansion slot area where ASUS puts its first expansion slot. Even that's going to be a tight fit if you've got a large CPU cooler and air cooler hanging down and you've got a graphics card with a backplate. So watch out for interference there. Moving along to the right side connectors, what we can see is the primary power delivery components for this motherboard. Now ASUS keeps this all in a specific region. They might argue that it's for voltage stability or whatever, but it's quite frankly because they haven't got the real estate up top in the general locations. You've got dual 8-pin connectors, and these are steel reinforced if that helps. And you've also got an additional 6-pin PCIe connector, and these feed current specifically to the CPU, so you get ample power delivery to the CPU, even if you're pushing really hard with sub-zero type cooling, so LN2 and the likes. And if you're overclocking hard, you've got a lot of power capability there realistically. Obviously moving down, you've got the 24-pin connector, and you've got dual internal USB 3.2 Gen 2 Type-C connectors. And then given the gearing towards enthusiasts and overclockers and people who will tinker with their system, I like seeing ASUS's probe points for manual voltage check-in. Moving around to the SATA area, we get a total of 8 SATA 6 gigabits per second ports. Now 4 of these operate from the sTRX 40 chipset and are completely fine, can be used whenever. And 4 of them, so 2 pairs, operate from a pair of ASMedia host controllers. The challenge there is that the ASMedia ports will be slower because they're sharing bandwidth, and also they share bandwidth with something else, meaning that they cannot be used if a specific M.2 slot is used at that time. So I would see this as a 4+4 configuration rather than a straight 8 SATA configuration, and you have to decide whether that's fine for your needs. The right-angled USB 3 5 gigabits connector here is also run through a hub. So it runs through a hub and shares bandwidth with the other internal USB 3 header. And therefore, if you put in a lot of data through those front panel ports, you might want to choose some of the rear I/O ports instead so you don't get slowdowns. I like that there's right angled on this side, but that's clearly going to be a challenge for narrower cases because this is an already so wide motherboard. So the fact that the secondary USB 3 connection is outwards facing is a smart move from ASUS in my opinion. And if we keep our focus on the connectors and we move around to the bottom edge, we can see the standard affair of connectors. So you've got HD audio, you've got USB 2.0, in this case 2 USB 2.0 headers, but one of them is specifically wired for only one port, so you get a 3-port connection between the 2 headers, and that's perfectly fine because some of the AIO coolers, for example, only need a 1-port connection, so it's actually quite a smart move in my opinion. You get internal USB 3 5 gigabits, like I just said, on the outwards facing variant. You get the node connectors so you can connect with ASUS's fan extension card and get a bunch more fan headers. Good to see. You get some onboard power buttons and some switches and some dials, and this is good for flicking through different modes, especially if you're heavily overclocking and are concerned about a BSOD before you've saved your benchmark results. And then another interesting point, because you can just drive so much power to graphics cards on this motherboard, is you get a downwards facing 4-pin Molex connector. And this is primarily going to be used if you are driving a lot of power to expansion cards and you're really pushing what the motherboard can deliver. You also get a water pump specific header, which is just a high amp header basically, but a water flow sensor and a few sensors for liquid cooling. And these are pretty cool to see. So if you're building a really high-end liquid cooling system, you can take use of some of these to basically give you more data about how your system's running, and I personally quite like that. I guess the only notable omission from the bottom edge connectors is any form of Thunderbolt 3 add-in card header. So if you want to use Thunderbolt 3, you're not going to get the full experience with this motherboard, unfortunately. In terms of PCIe expansion slots, you get by 16, by 8, by 16, by 8, and that's the bandwidth from the CPU specifically. The caveat there is that they're all full length, so don't be confused by the fact that they're full length. Of course, they run at different bandwidth I would say that ASUS slot decisions here are about as good as it gets for a motherboard of this caliber and this target audience. Ideally, you would have space in to install 4 dual slot graphics cards, but without going XL80X, you can't really do that on this motherboard. The positioning is pretty smart in my opinion. You can install a dual slot card up top, a dual slot card in the next X16 slot, and then you've got the bottom slot free to install another dual slot card, so you could have 3 in total if you've got an 8 slot chassis. That's pretty good. Cooling might be challenging, but it's good that you can install that with preferential bandwidth. Alternatively, you can install 2 triple slot graphics cards, but that will render the other 2 slots blocked. I guess the approach that I would personally go for is a pair of dual slot graphics cards running by X16, and then you've got an X8 and an X8 full length slot free. So if you want to put some single slot high bandwidth cards in there, I don't know, a network adapter or a RAID card or M.2 add-in card, for example, you can do that and you won't get bandwidth slowdowns and you won't interfere with the graphics card lanes specifically. The caveat I should add there is that the bottom slot does actually share bandwidth with one of the M.2 connectors. So if you have an M.2 SSD installed, stealing 4 Gen 4 lanes, this will run at PCIe Gen 4 by 4 instead of by 8, so you do have to watch out for that. M.2 capability on this motherboard is just ludicrous, quite frankly. You get a total of 5 slots on the board via an add-in card, also the DIMM.2 connector, which we've seen for a long time from ASUS, and it's a smart solution, a really, really smart solution. So you get the 2 slots on the motherboard, specifically on the front side in their usual location. These are fed by the CPU lanes and they support PCIe SSDs only. What I would say here is you want to install these when you're initially building the system because they are underneath this solid aluminium heatsink, which does a good job with the thermal pad at cooling the drives. But if you've already got something built in the system and you've got graphics cards or liquid cooling installed, getting this off is going to be a complete nightmare. You're going to have to dismantle your system. So use those slots initially, with the caveat that I'll come back to in a second. The other onboard M.2 slot is on the backside. So you've got a slot on the backside. Unfortunately, this doesn't feature any heatsink cooling, and the fact that it's around the backside means that it's going to be a challenge for airflow. It does, however, support PCIe and SATA devices because it's fed by the chipset. So this could be a useful backup slot, or perhaps for a drive that isn't going to get hit with heavy read operations and isn't going to be switched in and out quite frequently. And then the other 2 slots come via the DIMM.2 connector, which slots in just up by the DIMM slots specifically, so by the DIMM slots and the 24 pin, and this gives you 2 PCIe Gen 4 or SATA devices up to 110 millimeters in length. Really smart solution, good heatsink on here, thermal pads, very easy to install in direct airflow. I really like this, really like this. Now in terms of M.2 slot usage, there's a specific strategy that you have to follow, and this will depend on individual use cases, but I'm basically going to give my advice on how I would use this myself. Now the first slot that I would install in is the uppermost front side slot. And the reason I would go for this is because it doesn't share bandwidth with anything else, it gets its lanes from the CPU specifically, and because I do not want to uninstall this heatsink, this basically thermal shroud, after I've installed with my system, because it's going to be a nightmare. I'm going to have to pull everything out. So that would be my first slot. The second drive that I use, I would install into the second front slot. And the reason I would do this is because I would accept the caveat that this bottom PCIe connection is going to be forced down to a by 4 bandwidth. In my own personal usage, I don't need X8 down the bottom, so I would use this slot again because I don't want to uninstall this frame and I don't want to pull out my graphics cards and my other expansion cards in the middle of using my system day to day. The third slot I would then use is actually the rear slot. Now the rear slot shares bandwidth with the ASMedia SATA ports. So if you need those 4 ASMedia SATA ports, you cannot use the rear M.2 slot. But if you do not need the 4 ASMedia ports, you can use the M.2 slot. And the reason I would use this, and I would arguably actually use this before the other one, but I run 3 SSDs, so I would use this at the same time, is number 1, there's no way I want to be taking my motherboard out to install a new SSD if I saw a good deal and bought a new SSD and wanted to install it. Number 2, this runs through the chipset, so I probably wouldn't want to put it on something that is really going to get hit with heavy read-write operations. I want that directly tied to the CPU, so that's where the front side slots are a bit better in my opinion for those operations. And then also, this doesn't have any cooling, so it doesn't have a heatsink, it doesn't have a cooling mechanism, and because it's behind the motherboard, you're going to be limited on how thick the heatsink for the SSD can go, and on the airflow that's getting there. So basically I would put my OS SSD down here because it isn't going to be hit hard on a regular basis, and I'm just going to install it and leave it. I'm not going to mess around with it. I'm not going to upgrade it. I'm just going to leave it there. So there's my 3 main SSDs. What I would then do is use the DIMM.2 connector for whenever I upgrade or add additional SSDs. This gives you an extra 2 slots. You can run PCIe or SATA. They do run through the chipset, so you do have to watch out for bandwidth limitations, but it's so easy to deal with this card and just pull it out of the accessory bundle, install an SSD out of the system, and then quite literally just slot it in very quickly without messing around with anything else. I would leave this as the spare, and that's perhaps a bit harsh. I mean, if you're getting cooling concerns with any of the SSDs installed down here, maybe you've got a hot graphics card dumping heat, then you should consider using the DIMM.2 slot because its position is preferential for drive cooling. But otherwise, I would use this as a backup because the installation is so easy with it. Of course, I'm going to add the caveat that your mileage may vary and how you use this specifically is up to you, but the fact that ASUS gives you 5 slots with some caveats but a lot of flexibility is a really good positive in my opinion. The audio system is built around the Supreme FX S1220 audio codec, and that's actually driven by a Realtek ALC 4050H hub chipset because Threadripper, the platform, the chipset, does not natively support audio, so you have to convert a USB 2 port. You also get an ESS Sabre DAC, and you get specific Nichicon audio capacitors and a dedicated trace path on the PCB, so ASUS pays a lot of attention to the audio solution. One other cool feature is that you get gold-plated jacks on the back, as we see, which is pretty common, but they've got an LED, so maybe if you're in a dark room and you want to plug something in, it helps you a bit. As far as the rear I/O goes, I would actually say that ASUS ROG Zenith 2 Extreme Alpha is about as good as it gets for a motherboard of this caliber. In terms of USB Type-A ports, you get a total of 10, and 6 of these actually run at 10 gigabits per second, 3.2 Gen 2 bandwidth, and that's either from the CPU or from the chipset. The good thing is, whether they're running from the CPU or the chipset lanes, no hubs are used, so you shouldn't have any major bandwidth concerns for these ports, so I would use these as my primary ports for any high-speed data copying. The 4 Type-A 5 gigabits per second ports run through a hub controller, so you take one USB 3 connection from the chipset, convert that out into 4 physical ports, so you will get some bandwidth headaches, but for devices like keyboard, mouse, printer, whatever else you use, low priority, low bandwidth, they're very convenient to have the sheer number when you don't need the speed priority. And then importantly, you get 2 Type-C connections. So one of these is actually 10 gigabits per second Type-C, so 3.2 Gen 2, and one of these uses a dedicated USB 3.2 Gen 2 by 2 controller and therefore runs at 20 gigabits per second. So while you don't have the speed of Thunderbolt 3 on here, 20 gigabits per second USB in Type-C form is actually pretty good for high-speed data transfers. In terms of networking, you get 10 gigabit Ethernet provided by an Aquantia NIC, so that's the AQC107, and that's good to see. High-speed networking on an enthusiast motherboard like this is, as far as I'm concerned, an absolute must, especially for the Threadripper platform. And then to back up the primary 10 gigabit per second NIC, you get the old, trusty, reliable Intel i211AT, which is just completely bulletproof. I'm going to put some criticism on ASUS there. This is an expensive, high-end motherboard, and the Gigabyte competitor offers you 2 10 gigabits per second networking connections. Now, I know this is going to target overclockers who don't care about 10 gigabits per second, but it will also target people using a workstation for very premium applications who can afford a motherboard with all the bells and whistles. Therefore, I think it would be fair to ask that that secondary NIC was actually a higher speed NIC, maybe 2.5, maybe 5, maybe another 10 gigabits per second connection. 1 gigabit is fine, higher speed would have been even better on a motherboard of this price and caliber. Then in terms of Wi-Fi, you've got the Intel AX200 chipset, and that's up to 2.4 gigabits per second theoretical bandwidth for Wi-Fi 6 connectivity, and you also get Bluetooth 5.0 support. For the rear I/O buttons, obviously you've got one of the Type-A ports specifically dedicated to BIOS flashback duties, and then you've got a button on the back to be able to flash the BIOS without a CPU or anything else installed. Really useful feature. And then of course you've got the clear CMOS button, which I love to see on the back side of the motherboard. And the position of these buttons is very good because you're not going to accidentally try and plug in a keyboard or a mouse and press these buttons. It's far enough away from the USB ports to be pretty sensible as far as location goes. Of course, rounding out the rear I/O, we've got the usual set of audio connectors, and I'm also going to make note to the integrated rear I/O shield, which is to be expected of a premium motherboard of this caliber. And then on the front side, you've got the I/O cover, as well as the infinity display and the OLED display. In regards to headers, you get 4 conventional fan headers on the Zenith 2 Extreme Alpha, and the reason I call those conventional fan headers is because they are assigned fan control duties within the UEFI. Now, two of those are for the CPU specifically. You get a chassis fan down the bottom and then a chassis fan in your usual rear case position. You get another two 4-pin headers, but these are primarily intended for water pumps, so they're high amp headers. They control the water pump, but you can control them within the UEFI, so you can use them as normal fan headers if you want to. And then importantly, you get the fan extension card. So this gives you a further 6 4-pin fan headers on a breakout board. It also gives you another 3 12-volt RGB headers and 3 thermal sensor headers. So this is a pretty useful board, to say the least. I actually really like the way that ASUS does this. So 4 to 6, whichever way you count it, onboard fan headers is inadequate for a motherboard of this caliber. But when you add a further 6 via this breakout card, that's a pretty smart solution in my opinion. And what you can see is that this is 2.5-inch SSD sized. So it's quite easy to mount this behind your case on one of your rear 2.5-inch slots and then route the fan cables directly to this so they're not going to your motherboard. So you can hide the cables behind the motherboard tray and therefore ease up your cable management duties. And then in addition to the RGB headers on the fan extension card, you get 2 pairs on the motherboard itself, one of which in each pair is addressable and one of which is 12 volt. The power delivery solution is realistically the star of the show for this beast. It is a 16-stage power delivery solution controlled by the ASP1405 PWM controller, which is effectively a rebadged International Rectifiers 35201, so a very high performance 8-phase or 8-channel if you prefer PWM controller. Now you're going to say, hold on, 8 channels, 16 stages. Well, yes, ASUS is using teaming like they always use. It's not using phase doublers, so you don't get the latency penalty of phase doublers that you do on some competing solutions, but you still get the full 16-phase current capacity. But if you compare to Gigabyte's true 16-phase controller from Infineon, then you don't quite get the level of control granularity on the ASUS board with its 8 real control phases as you do on the Gigabyte board with its 16 real control phases. The key area, like I've already said, is the 90 amp power stages, and these are upgraded from the 70 amp power stages that we saw with the non-alpha Extreme. These are the TDA 21490 power stages from Infineon, and they're basically the best on the market, if you like. Yes, I know Intersil and some other guys have some DRMOS or driver MOS competing solutions, but realistically these are pretty much the best on the market. So when it comes to primary current capacity through the MOSFET, I'd go as far as saying this is basically the best motherboard on the market. And yes, I know ASRock has a 16-stage 90 amp solution, and there are some very competitive solutions, but overall when you look at the Infineon and International Rectifiers based design solution and the very overbuilt cooling hardware, this is pretty much the best power delivery solution on the market as far as theoretical current capability goes. Obviously ASUS is using an 8 real control phases, whereas Gigabyte has 16 real control phases. So depending on the application, Gigabyte may be a bit better in some scenarios, but on the Gigabyte Aorus Extreme, you're actually getting slightly lower current capability from the 70 amp stages. And then aside from the star of the show, which is the powered stages, you get 10K rated Japanese capacitors, and you also get 45 amp chokes. The VRM cooling is handled by a couple of very sizable slabs of aluminium heatsink. Now, I'm going to give ASUS some criticism here because quite frankly, these are more block by design rather than thinned heatsink by design. So they're not particularly efficient as a heatsink as we see from Gigabyte's competitor. But the fact that they're large aluminium slabs of metal connected via heat pipe to one another means that you get a lot of thermal capacitance because they're just basically large slabs of metal. So it's going to take quite a bit of time to put enough energy in there to heat them up. Now that's not ideal for heatsink thermal efficiency, but it does allow you to pump quite a lot of heat from the MOSFETs into the heatsinks without rising that MOSFET temperature too much. And when the heatsink itself just can't provide enough cooling capacity passively, then the two 30mm fans kick in. These two fans are Delta Superflow units, and they top out at about 9400 RPM according to the UEFI. ASUS actually programs them by default to stay completely inactive below 60 degrees Celsius, and even though their bearings are 60,000 hour rated, keeping them idle below 60 degrees Celsius is good for ensuring their lifespan is lengthened a bit. I think overall the VRM cooling solution is very overbuilt. It's very well built. I wouldn't say it's particularly well designed because it's not an efficient heatsink design, but I think it's going to be perfectly sufficient. I think especially when you combine it with the fact that the power stages underneath are so efficient and are going to be losing relatively little heat to resistivity, I think that's going to be pretty good for the heatsink to do its job comfortably. And also when you combine it with the fact that anybody using really extreme cooling might actually be cooling the VRM actively, so they might be taking the heatsink off, or you might get some chilled LN2 vapors, for example, going over the heatsink, which will help the cooling capacity. If we look at chipset cooling, so ASUS design here is actually quite smart. So the 40mm blower actually blows across the fin array and does a good job at removing the heat relatively efficiently. The 40mm fan for the chipset tops out at about 4,700 RPM, and it actually stays idle below 55 degrees Celsius by default, but the chipset for these AMD platforms heats up quite quickly, so most of the time it will be running active. This is also pretty smart because the SoC power delivery phases are actually mounted very close to the chipset, and they have a heatsink, so the incidental airflow from the chipset fan and the heatsink is actually going to pass over the heatsink for the SoC power delivery, so it keeps that cool. That's pretty smart in my opinion, because you're using that waste airflow, if you like, to just cool the SoC. I guess the main caveat here is with the positioning of the chipset fan. And if you've got a graphics card above this, then it's going to dump hot air straight into the chipset, which is going to drive up the chipset temperature and therefore drive up the fan speed and the noise output. But the unfortunate thing is with these Threadripper motherboards, especially if you're using multiple graphics cards, you cannot get around that point. The only alternative is to passively cool the chipset, and we've seen that motherboard vendors are not very keen on that approach, unfortunately. If you want more details and prefer a written format for the review, make sure you head on over to the Kicker website, where you can also see information about the UEFI and the software. Let's jump into the testing. Our TRX 40 motherboard test system uses AMD's new Ryzen Threadripper 3990X CPU. The 64-core beast and its ample connectivity and 280-watt TDP should stress even the high-end motherboards on this platform, especially when it's overclocked. Memory comes in the form of a 4x8GB kit of 3200MHz C14 G-Skill Trident Z RGB DDR4. The Samsung BDI ICs under the hood still prove their worth, even though Zen 2 is a good match for more expensive 3600 C16 modules. CPU cooling is handled by the Cooler Master Threadripper. We specifically use this air cooler as it has a TR4 sized contact plate, and our own testing has shown that cooling Threadripper's large heat spreader can cause cooling challenges with smaller AIO cold plates. Pixel pushing power comes from Gigabyte's beastly Aorus RTX 2080 Ti Extreme graphics card. This triple slot monster pushes the GPU performance to a level where we can identify differences between competing solutions. We use a custom fan curve to minimize thermal throttling and ensure consistency between test configurations. Power is delivered by the new Seasonic Prime TX1000 80+ titanium rated PSU. This 1kW beast serves up clean power and a pair of 8-pin CPU connectors that are ideal for our overclocking stress tests. We used the latest BIOS revision at the time of testing, that is 0807, and that uses the AGESA 1003 profile. If you want more information about our test procedures, our test system, and our comparison points, head on over to the Kickaroo website. Let's take a look at the performance. CPU-related performance from the ROG Zenith 2 Extreme Alpha is very competitive against MSI's flagship TRX 40 Creator. Cinebench performance is basically close enough to call the result roughly a draw between the two motherboards. The same can be said for Blender in both the BMW and Classroom tests, although the latter does see ASUS winning by 1 second, but that victory is largely due to numerical rounding of the recorded results. 7-zip results do differ slightly based on memory performance differences and the affinity towards bandwidth and latency for each test. With that said, we still see more or less a performance draw between the motherboards. Memory bandwidth numbers shown by the ASUS board are not as high as the figures from MSI's competitor. That result holds true in both Cysoft Sandra and AIDA64 testing. ASUS also loses out in our AIDA64 memory latency test, so we'll have to see if any further results are affected, especially gaming. Gaming performance is competitive on the ASUS motherboard and is practically level with the figures shown by MSI's TRX 40 Creator. A slight lead is shown for the MSI offering in both Shadow of the Tomb Raider and 3D Mark Time Spy, but I don't see this difference as large enough to create cause for concern. Nevertheless, it's worth factoring in if you're a benchmarker who is keen on pushing for records in the likes of 3D Mark. Using the board-mounted M.2 slot, performance from our PCIe Gen 4 SSD is right where we would expect it to be at 5GB per second peak. ASUS's cooling solution for the onboard SSDs on the front side is effectively an oversized slab of metal with a thermal pad, and it has no problem keeping our speedy M.2 SSD cooled. we stayed below 60 degrees Celsius throughout the Crystal Disk Mark run. SATA performance looks perfectly fine for the onboard connections tied to the TRX40 chipset. Right Mark Audio Analyzer rates the ASUS audio system as very good, with most of the categories scoring as excellent. Overclocking with a Ryzen Threadripper 3990X 64-core CPU truly is a battle of how much heat your cooling solution can deal with. As such, we switched to the ludicrously capable Ice Giant Pro Siphon Elite prototype cooler that comfortably outperforms our Cooler Master alternative. Using Precision Boost Overdrive with the budget set to 1000 amps, 1000 amps and 1000 watts, we checked how far we could push the chip while the cooling solution maintained stable operating temperatures. Fundamentally, this is very similar to a manual overclocking technique, which we know most of this motherboard's buyers will be more interested in. The key difference is that the Proficient Precision Boost Overdrive algorithm is simply doing the overclocking work for us until the CPU cooler and/or motherboard and CPU can take no more. Pushing the system with back-to-back Cinebench R20 NT runs as the stress test, the ASUS ROG Zenith 2 Extreme Alpha managed to hold the CPU at a stable frequency of just over 3.8 GHz after 30 minutes of loading. The CPU package power draw peaked at around 650 to 700 watts according to software, and wall readings were around the mid 800 watt mark in general, with peaks as high as just under 900 watts. Clearly ASUS's choice of power delivery components is smart and well implemented. That's proven when shifting over 600 watts through the VRM system seems to be of little hassle. ASUS provides a solid set of onboard monitoring readings. Values such as VRM and PCH temperatures and fan speeds are clear, though you don't get readings from the likes of PCIe slot areas as you do with Gigabyte competitors. After 30 minutes of constant back-to-back multi-threaded runs, the Cinebench R20 score dropped to around 29,700 points. A reduction of only around 1% from 10 minutes of runtime to 30 minutes of runtime highlights the ASUS motherboard's ability to cool the VRM effectively. ASUS uses reasonable stock voltage levels and therefore maintains the Threadripper CPU's 280 watt package power. The overall system power when the CPU is pushed hard is around 10 watts higher than MSI's competitor. It would not be unreasonable to assign those 10 watts to ancillary components such as the RGB lighting, additional fans if active, and onboard controllers. ASUS's overall VRM design is superb. 16 high current power stages combined with an overbuilt and actively cooled heatsink make for an excellent combination. At stock, the VRM sensor hit a maximum of around 60 degrees Celsius and therefore never forced the fan to ramp up by any meaningful amount. Clearly, a 280 watt CPU package load is easy pickings for this motherboard's caliber of power delivery system. Overclocking pushed the VRM temperature way past 60 degrees Celsius within a few minutes of load being applied. With the Ice Giant CPU cooler applied and around 600-650 watts CPU package power being delivered, the VRM sensor reading was just below 90 degrees Celsius, with the fans running at around 7,000 RPM. While an undeniably high fan speed and operating temperature were recorded, pushing that much power through an air-cooled system is a tough task, but ASUS's motherboard holds up very well. Chipset cooling was perfectly fine, with the temperature running in the mid-60s using a perfectly tolerable fan speed around 3,000 RPM. I'd say in summary that there really is very little to say about the ASUS ROG Zenith 2 Extreme Alpha motherboard, and the reason there is because it just delivers so many positives with so few negatives. It's hard to find criticism, and it's very, very easy to find praise of this clear flagship product. You get arguably the best power delivery solution for the TRX40 market. You get 5 M.2 connections via different modes. You get a 1.77 inch OLED display, you get good onboard RGB, 10 gigabit networking, a really robust cooling system. It's just overall a very premium, very well built, very, very in-depth motherboard. I will start with a few slight negatives, and one of those is the sizing. So this is a very wide EATX motherboard which has challenges from a case install perspective, but in my opinion it's far easier to deal with than the lengthened XL-ATX format. So it's just something to watch out for. It's perhaps a little bit of a harsh criticism because ASUS needs to go to EATX to fit everything on board. I guess one of the other minor complaints that we could highlight is that you don't get an M.2 add-in card adapter. We see MSI and Gigabyte with their competitors give an expander card that allows you to install multiple M.2 SSDs on there with active cooling and then install an expansion slot. ASUS doesn't provide this, but I'm actually quite positive about the fact that they do not provide it. They could easily fit into the price because the price of this board is very, very high. But I think the fact that they give you 5 M.2 connections anyway, via different modes, is better than giving you a card which steals one of your expansion slots. So yes, you get some bandwidth headaches, but you can fundamentally install 3 M.2 SSDs on board, and then another 2 via the DIMM.2 card. So yes, some slight criticism that a 4-way M.2 adapter, which ASUS does make and does sell, isn't included with this board like it is with some of the competitors. But I would argue that ASUS' approach of giving you alternative solutions to fit in 5 M.2 devices is superior, provided you're happy with 5 M.2 slots, of course. On the positive side of things, ASUS' power delivery solution is pretty much the best on the market. The 1690 amp power stages were able to deliver a continuous 600 plus watts to our 3990X 64-core CPU under Cinebench type stress workloads, and this was enough power to actually make our CPU cooling the realistic bottleneck there. So very, very strong power delivery solution. Now during that workload we did see temperatures and noise output from the fans that were perhaps slightly higher than we would have liked, but the fact that this motherboard can even deliver such heavy sustained loads is a real positive, because I think lower caliber of motherboards would not be able to keep up there. So it proved its worth for the high performance power delivery solution. There's no doubt the £900 is hard to swallow, even for a flagship motherboard on a really high performance TRX 40 platform. And even if you're spending close to £4,000 on the 64-core CPU, £900 on a motherboard is still a lot of money. But if you are going to use the features, and you do need the features, if you want a really premium board, because the rest of your system is so expensive anyway, you figure that you might as well just get the premium board because you can, then the Zenith 2 Extreme Alpha is a top option. It offers basically everything you want. Very few areas where you can say, I really wish I had that, I really wish ASUS included that, or I don't like that decision. It really is a flagship product in every single sense of the word. So I've been Luke Hill for Kit Guru. Thank you for watching this video for the ASUS ROG Zenith 2 Extreme Alpha motherboard, this flagship beast from ASUS. Let us know what you think in the comment section down below. Do you think the price is reasonable given the features on offer? How do you think this stacks up against the MSI and the Gigabyte and the ASUS ROG competitors? Let us know in the comment section down below. Make sure you head on over to the Kit Guru website to see the full written review with more details, more charts, more analysis. And make sure you give us a like and subscribe if you do like the video, you know, do all that YouTube stuff. And if you want to help support us, check out our Patreon and buy a cool t-shirt. See you next time.